Looking at old maps from the 1700s, you'll notice something strange. A name appears again and again across vast stretches of Asia. Not a small region, not a minor territory, but an enormous landmass, labeled consistently across different languages, different empires, different cartographers. The name was Tartaria, and then, suddenly, it vanished. Not over centuries, not gradually. Within a few decades, this name that had dominated European cartography for generations simply disappeared from the maps as if it had never existed at all. But the disappearance of a name is just the beginning of this mystery. Because if we look closely at when this happened, at the exact moment in history when Tartaria began to fade from human memory, we find something even stranger. We find a day when the sky itself seemed to fail. A day that should have been like any other, but instead became one of the most terrifying events in recorded history. A day that official sources mention only in passing, as if acknowledging it fully would open doors that are meant to stay closed. May 19th, 1780. New England. It should have been an ordinary spring morning. Farmers were already in their fields. Markets were opening. Children were heading to school. The sun had risen on schedule just a few hours earlier. Everything was normal. And then, without warning, the light began to fail. Not the gradual darkening of storm clouds rolling in, not the dimming that comes with an eclipse. This was different. Witnesses described it as sudden, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the heavens. By what should have been mid-morning, the darkness was so complete that people could not see their hands in front of their faces. Candles were lit at breakfast tables. Livestock wandered back to their barns, convinced that night had fallen. Birds stopped singing mid-flight. The entire natural order seemed to collapse. Official history has a simple explanation for this event. They call it the Dark Day, and they tell us it was caused by forest fires. Smoke from distant burning woods, carried by unusual wind patterns, temporarily blocked the sun. A natural phenomenon. An unfortunate coincidence. Move along, nothing to see here. But this explanation, like so many others in official history, crumbles the moment you examine it closely. Forest fires do not behave this way. Smoke diffuses. It creates haze, not absolute darkness. It dims light gradually, not instantly. People in 1780 were not strangers to fire or smoke. They lived in a world heated by wood, lit by candles and oil lamps. They understood what smoke looked like, how it behaved, what it smelled like. And what they described on May 19th was not smoke. They described darkness arriving like a wall. They described a boundary where light still existed on one side and complete blackness on the other. They described the moon rising that night, blood red through the gloom, visible but distorted, as if seen through something far stranger than simple wood, smoke. The darkness lasted for hours. In some locations, it actually deepened as the day progressed rather than lifting. Even after sunset, the sky remained wrong. Stars appeared in unfamiliar positions or with unusual colors. Animals refused to leave their shelters for days afterward. This was not a weather event. This was something else entirely. And here's where the timing becomes impossible to ignore. Because the dark day of 1780 sits at a very specific moment in history. It sits at the exact point when Tartaria begins its rapid disappearance from maps, when populations seem to vanish without clear displacement, when entire regions are suddenly reclassified and reorganized with remarkable speed and minimal documentation. Let's look at the maps. In 1700, nearly every major atlas in Europe shows Tartaria. French maps, Dutch maps, British maps, Russian maps. The spelling varies slightly, Tartaria, Tartari, Grande, Tartari, but the label is consistent and it covers an enormous territory. This wasn't a vague placeholder name for unknown lands. These were regions that Europeans actively traded with, that sent ambassadors, that appeared in diplomatic correspondence. Tartaria was real enough that it had internal divisions, administrative centers, recognized borders, and then something changed. By 1850, the name is effectively gone, not replaced with a better name for the same region, just gone, erased. The territories it once labeled are suddenly described as belonging to other empires, other ethnic groups, other administrative frameworks entirely. No war explains this. No conquest matches the scale. No treaty accounts for such a massive reorganization. The change happens quietly, administratively, bureaucratically. Official history tells us this was simply improved geographic knowledge. As Europeans learned more about Asia, they realized Tartaria was too vague a term and replaced it with more accurate regional names. But this explanation doesn't match the source evidence. Cartographers in the 1700s were not ignorant children guessing at the world. They were professionals working from accumulated knowledge, travel accounts, state intelligence, and diplomatic records. They didn't use broad labels for centuries without reason, and they didn't abandon established terminology without documentation. When borders change, when regions are reclassified, there are reasons. Treaties are signed, wars are fought, populations migrate, empires expand. These processes leave records, they leave evidence, they leave traces in correspondence, in administrative documents, in the lived experience of millions of people. But for Tartaria, these records are strangely absent. There's no comprehensive account of its population being conquered, no long wars of absorption, no mass migrations, no refugee crises. The name simply fades from the maps as if the entire region and everyone in it had been quietly erased from human memory. And this is where the dark day re-enters, our investigation. Because timing matters. The disappearance of Tartaria from maps accelerates dramatically in the decades immediately following 1780. The overlap is too precise to ignore, a major atmospheric anomaly that terrifies entire populations, followed immediately by political upheaval, followed by a sweeping revision of how vast portions of the world are labeled and understood. This pattern, official history wants us to believe, is pure coincidence. But let's examine what actually happened in the years following the Dark Day. The early 1780s see a cascade of environmental disasters. In 1783, a persistent dry fog settles over Europe. It's not like normal fog. It doesn't behave like mist or clouds. Contemporary observers describe it as hanging in the air for months, dimming the sun, creating strange optical effects, irritating eyes and lungs. The sun appears weak and reddened even at noon. This is followed by brutal winters. 1784 sees the Mississippi River freeze solid. Crappie failures spread across multiple continents. Famine follows, social unrest intensifies, and during this exact same period, we see massive political restructuring. Old territorial claims are abandoned. New administrative frameworks are imposed. Populations are redefined, reclassified, reorganized. The world that emerges from this period looks fundamentally different from the world that existed before it. Not because of slow evolution, because of rapid systematic change. Now, official history treats each of these events separately. The Dark Day was smoke from fires. The dry fog of 1783 was a volcanic eruption in Iceland. The harsh winters were just unusual weather. The political changes were the natural result of enlightenment and progress. Each event gets its own isolated explanation, neat and tidy and carefully disconnected from everything else. But what if they weren't separate at all? What if we're looking at a single prolonged catastrophe, a cascading series of failures that broke the continuity of the previous world? Let's think about what happens when a civilization collapses. Not in movies, not in dramatic battle scenes, but in reality. Systems fail, supply chains break, administrative structures cease to function, knowledge is lost, and most importantly, those who come after, those who inherit the ruins, have choices to make. They can acknowledge what came before, preserving its memory and learning from its fate, or they can claim it as their own, rewriting the story to serve their purposes. History, after all, is written by those who survive, not by those who perish. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of the Tartaria mystery: the buildings. If we accept the official timeline, we're asked to believe something remarkable. In the early 1800s, across vast stretches of territory that had supposedly been undeveloped frontier or scattered tribal lands, monumental architecture suddenly appears. Not simple structures, not modest buildings, grand palaces, massive government halls, university complexes, exhibition centers, courthouses with perfect classical proportions, structures built with precision stonework, complex engineering, and architectural sophistication that rivals anything from ancient Rome or Greece. And we're told all of this was constructed in just a few decades by populations that had supposedly only recently arrived or organized themselves. Let's look at the logistics. Stone doesn't move itself. A single classical column requires quarrying, shaping, transporting, and erecting multiple tons of precisely cut stone. Multiply that by thousands of columns across hundreds of buildings, across entire continents, and you're talking about an industrial effort that should have left mountains of documentation. Contracts, payrolls, supply chains, transport records, quarry locations, labor disputes, construction accidents, progress reports. But for many of the most ambitious structures built supposedly in the early to mid-1800s, these records are remarkably sparse. What we have instead are dedication plaques, inscriptions declaring ownership and completion, but not origin. Official histories written decades later describing achievements with confidence, but little specificity. Celebratory narratives focusing on symbolism rather than logistics. And here's what makes this even stranger. When we look at photographs from the mid-1800s, the earliest days of photography, these monumental buildings are already there. They're not being built. They're not surrounded by scaffolding and construction sites. They're finished, occupied, functioning. And in many cases, they already look old, not new and pristine, but weathered, worn, repaired in places where no initial construction should have required repairs. Foundations that appear older than the structures above them. Stonework that shows erosion patterns inconsistent with the supposed age of the building. This pattern repeats across the world. In America, grand classical buildings appear in frontier towns that had been established only years earlier. In Russia, monumental architecture fills cities supposedly built from scratch. In Australia, structures of impressive scale and sophistication emerge in a colony that official history describes as barely populated. The architectural language is remarkably uniform. Same proportions, same engineering solutions, same decorative elements, as if they were all built according to the same template, by the same civilization. But we're told they were designed independently by different nations, different cultures, different architects who had limited contact with each other. The transmission of architectural knowledge happens, of course. Styles spread, techniques are shared, but transmission leaves traces, drawings circulate, manuals are published, schools are founded, apprentices travel. There should be a clear paper trail showing how this global architectural convergence occurred. That trail is remarkably thin. What if these buildings weren't constructed in the 1800s at all? What if they were inherited? What if a previous civilization, call it Tartaria or not, had already established this infrastructure, and the populations that came after simply claimed it? This isn't speculation. This is pattern recognition. When you find finished buildings in newly established settlements, when you find architectural sophistication that exceeds the documented capabilities of the supposed builders, when you find uniformity across vast distances without clear transmission, you're not looking at construction. You're looking at inheritance. And inheritance has always been easier to claim than to build. A dedication plaque doesn't prove authorship. An inscription doesn't document origin. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and in the early 1800s, across much of the world, possession was being rapidly established over structures whose origins were becoming inconvenient to explain. This brings us to the population question. If Tartaria existed as a coherent region for centuries, labeled consistently on maps, referenced in diplomatic records, known to European traders and travelers, then it had people. Populations don't appear on maps without existing. Administrative divisions don't persist for generations unless there are people being administered. So, where did they go? Large populations do not disappear quietly. They leave archaeological evidence. They leave linguistic traces. They leave genetic markers. They leave cultural continuity even when political names change. When empires expand and absorb new territories, there are records. Conquest generates documentation. Resistance creates chronicles. Integration produces administrative correspondence. Population movements leave traces in censuses, tax records, land claims, church registers, military rolls. For Tartaria, these traces are mysteriously absent. There's no comprehensive account of a population being conquered and absorbed. No long campaigns described in military histories. No chronicles of mass displacement. No sudden appearance of millions of refugees in neighboring regions. The historical record simply moves forward as if the question doesn't exist. As if the territories once labeled Tartaria were always sparsely populated, always backward, always awaiting development. But this narrative contradicts the very maps that showed these regions as organized, administered, and significant enough to warrant consistent labeling for centuries. What we see instead is a strange pattern of redefinition. In the early 1800s, populations are suddenly reclassified. New ethnic categories are imposed. New administrative frameworks are established. New identities are assigned, often retroactively. This kind of redefinition doesn't require people to move. It requires them to be relabeled. But even relabeling leaves traces. Languages shift gradually. Customs persist across generations. Material culture survives. Folklore preserves memory. In this case, those echoes are faint. There's no sustained academic effort to trace continuity between the populations described before 1780 and those recorded afterward. No major archaeological programs dedicated to investigating what existed in these regions prior to their reorganization. The narrative simply resets cleanly, as if history itself had been cleared and rewritten. This is how forgetting happens. Not through dramatic destruction, but through administrative quiet. When a name disappears from maps, when populations are redefined, when structures are reattributed, and when no one asks questions about the transition, continuity breaks. And once continuity is broken, the past becomes malleable. It can be reshaped to serve the present. It can be simplified. It can be made comfortable. Let's return once more to the Dark Day because its significance isn't just in what happened, but in what it revealed. For a few hours on May 19th, 1780, the natural order failed. The sky, which humanity depends on for light, warmth, and the very rhythm of life itself, stopped functioning as expected. People were terrified, not confused, not puzzled, terrified. Their writings from the period don't speak of curiosity about an interesting weather event. They speak of dread, of the distinct feeling that something fundamental had gone wrong with the world itself. Legislative sessions were suspended because delegates couldn't see each other across the room. Churches filled with people seeking reassurance that the apocalypse wasn't upon them. Some observers genuinely believed they were witnessing the end of days. Why did an educated population in 1780 react with such profound fear to what official history now dismisses as simple smoke? Because they knew something we've forgotten. They understood, perhaps instinctively, that their world was more fragile than it appeared, that the system supporting civilization, both natural and human, could fail without warning. And when the sky went dark, it confirmed what some may have already sensed, that something was ending, that the world they knew was giving way to something else. Within months of the Dark Day, that transformation accelerated. Environmental stress intensified. Political structures reorganized. Old names began their fade from the maps. New narratives took hold. And by the early 1800s, the world had been reshaped so thoroughly that even asking about what came before began to feel strange. This is what a reset looks like. Not a single apocalyptic event, not fire from the sky or a moment of total destruction, but a cascading failure of systems, environmental pressure, social disruption, administrative collapse, and then inheritance. Those who came after stepping into infrastructure they didn't build, claiming achievements they didn't earn, and writing histories that erase the very possibility of predecessors. The evidence for this is everywhere once you learn to see it. It's in the timing of map revisions, all clustered around the same narrow window of years. It's in the absence of construction documentation for buildings that appear fully formed in the photographic record. It's in the silence surrounding population transitions that should have generated mountains of records. It's in the architectural uniformity across vast distances without clear transmission. It's in the environmental anomalies dismissed individually but alarming when viewed together. It's in the speed with which new political orders establish themselves without prolonged resistance. It's in the confidence with which 19th century powers claim territories and structures as their own without acknowledging what or who came before. None of this requires believing in a single global empire or an advanced lost civilization. It requires only acknowledging that continuity was broken, that systems which had functioned for centuries stopped functioning, that populations were disrupted, displaced, or redefined, that infrastructure outlasted the civilization that created it, and that those who inherited that infrastructure found it easier to claim authorship than to preserve memory. Official history prefers clean narratives. It wants progress, not disruption. It wants innovation, not inheritance. It wants beginnings, not endings. So, it treats the dark day as an isolated curiosity, Tartaria as a cartographic error, the population silence as unremarkable, and the architectural anomalies as triumphs of 19th century industry. Each explanation stands alone, technically plausible, carefully disconnected from the others. But history doesn't operate in isolation. Events cascade, systems interact, patterns emerge. And when we step back far enough to see those patterns, a different picture forms. The late 18th century wasn't just an age of revolution and enlightenment. It was an age of transition from one world to another, a transition marked by environmental upheaval, administrative reset, and systematic forgetting. The dark day sits at the beginning of that transition, a moment when the sky itself seemed to announce that something had changed. What followed was decades of reorganization so thorough that the very foundations of the previous world were absorbed and reattributed. By the mid-1800s, the process was complete. The old maps were updated. The old names were gone. The buildings had new owners. The populations had new identities. And history had a new story, one that began with the present and looked backward only as far as was convenient. Anything older, anything that complicated the narrative, anything that suggested inheritance rather than achievement was quietly set aside. This is why the Tartaria question matters. Not because we need to prove it was a specific empire or recover its exact boundaries, but because its disappearance represents something larger. It represents the ease with which continuity can be broken, with which memory can be erased, with which history can be rewritten to serve the present. When a name that appeared on maps for centuries vanishes without explanation, when populations fade from record without displacement, when structures appear without construction, and when all of this happens in the same narrow window following a day when the sky itself failed, we're not looking at coincidence. We're looking at a pattern of disruption, inheritance, and deliberate forgetting. The evidence hasn't disappeared. It's still there in the stones, in the maps, in the photographs, in the gaps where documentation should exist but doesn't. It's still there in the dark day itself, remembered just enough to be dismissed, but not enough to be understood. History didn't erase these things. It simply stopped asking about them. It accepted explanations that were good enough to move on, even when those explanations left fundamental questions unanswered. But we don't have to accept that silence. We can look at the maps and ask why the revisions happened so quickly. We can look at the buildings and ask where the construction records went. We can look at the population data and ask what happened to continuity. We can look at the dark day and ask why such a profound disruption has been reduced to a footnote, because these questions don't threaten history. They strengthen it. A past that can withstand scrutiny is more honest than one that depends on convenient omissions. A timeline that acknowledges disruption is more accurate than one that pretends progress was smooth and inevitable. The world that exists today was built on foundations we didn't lay. We inherited more than we built. We claimed more than we created. And somewhere in the late 18th century, at a moment marked by darkness falling across the sky, that inheritance began. What came before may never be fully recovered. The records are too thin, the erasure too complete. But acknowledging that something came before, that continuity was broken, that the official story is incomplete, that's where understanding begins. So the next time you see a grand old building with a plaque declaring it was built in the early 1800s, look at the stonework, look at the weathering, look at the foundations. Ask yourself if what you're seeing matches what you're being told. The next time you see a map from the 1700s with Tartaria labeled across vast territories, ask what happened to those territories and the people who lived there. The next time you hear about the dark day of 1780, ask why such a profound event has been treated as trivial. Because history is not what we're told happened. History is what we can prove, what we can demonstrate, what survives scrutiny. And when scrutiny reveals patterns of disruption, inheritance, and systematic forgetting, all clustered around a moment when the sky itself went dark, we owe it to ourselves to ask what really happened. Not to chase fantasies or invent certainties, but to acknowledge that the story we've been given is incomplete. And incompleteness is just another word for mystery. The investigation doesn't end here. It continues wherever someone notices what doesn't quite fit, what was too easily explained, what was too quickly forgotten. The past is not settled. It's still being discovered. And sometimes, the most important discoveries begin not with finding new evidence, but with finally asking the right questions about evidence that was always there.